Hello, everybody, and thanks for checking out my Mobilizing Ideas blog post on the current theme of sustaining anti-Trump resistance. My name is Paul Gorski. I'm a longtime activist, mostly focused on racial and economic justice issues and dabbling in other issues as well. I also teach social justice and human rights courses at George Mason University. I decided to address the question, how do activists effectively avoid burnout, which is one of the questions we were given as a possible topic for a blog post. I chose this because for the last several years I've been studying activist burnout as a researcher for the Center for the Advancement of Well-Being at George Mason University, and also following ways people talk about burnout and self-care in various online and print forums. And I worry that there's a dimension of that conversation about activist burnout that's missing from a lot of those conversations. I want to focus specifically on, in this blog post, specifically on racial justice activism. Recently, I've interviewed 30 racial justice activists from across the U.S. who have actually experienced burnout and then recovered from their burnout and returned to their activism. And I interviewed them about the sources of their burnout, where their burnout came from, and how they recovered from their burnout. The activists I interviewed described a lot of sources of burnout. Some were about sort of their deep levels of understanding about the scope of racism and white supremacy and how it affects people in their communities. So understanding the difference between interpersonal racial conflict and the scope of structural racial injustice and just carrying the weight of that knowledge and understanding. Others talked about the threat or the reality of being punished for their activism, whether by police officers or others. Others talked about just the sheer numbers of hours and the amount of energy that they put into their activism that just becomes exhausting. And you can see how all those causes are interrelated. But what was interesting, and a piece of this that I don't often see discussed in forums about activist burnout, overall, the biggest source of burnout that the people I interviewed described weren't any of these sources, but instead their biggest source of burnout was actually white racial justice activists, not white people in general, not white people who are against the activism that they're doing, but white people who also identify as racial justice activists. So the activists I interviewed described a lot of very disturbing ways white racial justice activists contribute to their burnout. So for instance, they described white activists undermining their racial justice work, always trying to soften the honesty of their voices or to shift the focus from racial justice to racial harmony. They described white activists taking credit for their ideas. They described white activists kind of elbowing our way to the front of the room, happy to participate in activism as long as they could be given a leadership position within the movement or organization. They described a lot of different types of backbiting, of shushing, of other conditions in which white racial justice activists are splashing our privilege and entitlement all over racial justice spaces. In essence, recreating the racism and white supremacy that we claim to be fighting within the racial justice spaces in which we participate. Now, of course, there is no amount of self-care that can cure this source of burnout. And this is why it's a bit of a problem that so much of the focus about avoiding burnout is really around self-care. You know, eat better, drink better, learn to unhook from activism for short amounts of time. Perhaps all of that stuff is important, but that can't cure this particular source of activist burnout. So I would like to challenge white racial justice activists in particular to ask a different question about burnout. Not just how can we avoid burnout, but how can we ensure that we aren't participating in this? How can we commit to not splashing our privilege and entitlement all over activists of color, helping to cause their burnout, or at least hastening their burnout, and as a result, destabilizing movements for racial justice. We could start by having the humility and commitment to enter racial justice spaces. Understanding our role in those racial justice spaces is to serve and not to lead, to do what we're asked to do to help forge a path toward liberation that is identified and created by activists of color. If I'm not able to do that as a white racial justice activist, better that I stay away and not be the source of other activists' burnout. I'm going to end my blog post there. Thanks for checking it out, and I look forward to the conversation.